If you're enjoying this tale from the dusty trails of the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of courage, love, and redemption from America's frontier days. Now, let's dive into our story. The oil lamps flickered against the smoky haze of the Red River Saloon as Clara wiped down glasses with trembling hands. Her once slender frame now carried the unmistakable curve of new life beneath her faded blue dress. 6 months along, she'd managed to keep working despite the whispers and sideways glances from the townsfolk of Redemption Creek. Outside, thunder rumbled across the Montana sky, promising another violent summer storm. Clara paused in her work, one hand instinctively moving to her belly as she felt the baby stir. She'd grown accustomed to the loneliness, the uncertainty of raising a child alone in a town that barely tolerated her profession. The saloon doors burst open with a crash that made every patron freeze. A tall figure stumbled inside, rain-soaked and bleeding from a wound on his left shoulder. His dark hair hung in wet strands across a face marked by sun and hardship. Most striking were his eyes, steel grey and haunted by something deeper than physical pain. Clara recognized him immediately from the wanted posters that had appeared around town 2 weeks prior. Jake Morrison, wanted for bank robbery and the killing of 3 lawmen during his escape from Millerville. The reward was substantial, $500 dead or alive. Every bounty hunter within 200 miles would be tracking him. The stranger's gaze swept the room, taking in the frightened faces of gamblers and drinkers who had suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. His eyes settled on Clara, standing behind the bar with her cleaning rag clutched against her chest. For a moment, neither moved, the tension thick as morning fog. Jake approached the bar slowly, favoring his injured side. Blood seeped through his torn shirt, creating dark stains that mixed with the rainwater still dripping from his clothes. He placed a gold coin on the scarred wooden surface, the metal catching the lamplight with a dull gleam. "Whiskey," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "The bottle." Clara hesitated, glancing toward the back room where old Pete, the saloon owner, had disappeared at the first sign of trouble. She poured the drink with steady hands, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. Jake downed the whiskey in one burning gulp, then poured another. The alcohol seemed to steady him, and he looked directly at Clara for the first time. She saw intelligence in those grey eyes, and something else, a weariness that spoke of burdens carried too long. "You're Clara Whitmore," he said. It wasn't a question. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially about a woman in her situation. She nodded, wondering how a wanted outlaw knew her name, wondering if she should scream for help or run for the back door. Instead, she found herself asking, "How bad is it?" She nodded toward his shoulder. Jake looked surprised by the question, perhaps expecting fear rather than concern. He flexed his arm experimentally, wincing at the movement. "Bullet's still in there. Doc's probably already been warned to watch for me." Clara set down her cleaning rag and moved closer, professional instincts overriding her caution. She'd tended enough bar fights and accidents to recognize when a man needed medical attention. "Let me see," she said, reaching for his shirt. Jake caught her wrist gently but firmly. "Why would you help me? You know who I am." His touch was surprisingly warm despite the rain, and Clara felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. "Because you're bleeding all over my clean floor," she replied, attempting lightness. A smile ghosted across Jake's weathered features, the first she'd seen since he entered. He released her wrist and allowed her to examine the wound. The bullet had torn through muscle, but missed anything vital. It would need to come out soon, before infection set in. "There's a room upstairs," Clara said quietly. "Old Pete keeps medical supplies there." She glanced around the now empty saloon. Word of Jake's arrival would spread quickly, bringing the sheriff and possibly worse. They didn't have much time. Jake followed her up the narrow staircase, each step an obvious effort. The upstairs room was small but clean, with a single window overlooking the main street. Clara gathered supplies while Jake sat heavily on the bed, his face pale but determined. As she worked to remove the bullet, Jake spoke quietly about his journey to Redemption Creek. He'd been running for 3 weeks, staying ahead of possess and bounty hunters through sheer willpower and luck that was rapidly running out. The law was closing in, and he knew it. "Why here?" Clara asked, focusing on her work to avoid looking at his face. "Why risk coming to town?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Clara thought he might not answer. When he spoke, his words carried a weight that made her hands still. "I heard about you," he said, "about your situation. Figured maybe we could help each other." Clara looked up sharply, confusion clear in her green eyes. Jake met her gaze steadily, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. Not desperation exactly, but a kind of quiet determination. "I don't understand," she said, though part of her feared she did. Jake leaned back against the pillow, studying her face in the lamplight. "You need a father for that baby. I need a wife before they stretch my neck. Seems like we might find a solution that works for both of us." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Clara's hands moved automatically as she bandaged his shoulder, her mind reeling from the unexpected proposal. Marriage to a wanted man would solve her immediate problems, but create a host of others. "You don't even know me," she whispered, tying off the bandage with more force than necessary. Jake caught her hand again, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "I know you're brave enough to help a stranger. I know you're facing this alone when you shouldn't have to. That's enough for now." Thunder crashed overhead, followed by the steady drum of rain against the window. Clara pulled her hand free and moved to look outside. The street was empty, except for a mangy dog seeking shelter under the general store's awning. Soon the storm would pass, and with it any chance of escape. "They'll hang you anyway," she said, not turning around. "Marriage won't change that." Jake's reflection appeared beside hers in the rain-streaked glass. "Maybe, but at least your child would have a name, and you'd have whatever money I've got left." The practicality of it hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd lain awake countless nights wondering how she'd manage alone, how she'd provide for a child in a town that saw her as little better than a common prostitute. Jake's offer, however unconventional, represented security she desperately needed. "What's in it for you?" she asked, finally turning to face him. Jake returned to the bed, moving carefully to avoid straining his injury. "Redemption, I suppose, a chance to do something right before—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Outside, a horse whinnied in the distance, followed by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Jake tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun at his hip. Clara felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the rhythm of multiple riders. "Back door," she said urgently, but Jake shook his head. "They'll have it covered by now. Professional bounty hunters always do." He stood carefully, checking his weapon with practiced efficiency. "Looks like we're out of time for long engagements." The hoofbeats stopped outside the saloon, followed by the jingle of spurs on the wooden walkway below. Clara heard old Pete's voice, nervous and eager to please, followed by a deeper tone she didn't recognize. Bounty hunters, just as Jake had predicted. "Marry me," Jake said suddenly, his grey eyes intense in the lamplight. "Right now. Whatever happens next, at least your child will be legitimate." Clara stared at him, her mind struggling to process the surreal situation. "How?" "There's no preacher, no—" "Common law marriage," Jake interrupted. "Perfectly legal if we both consent and live as husband and wife, even for a few minutes." The sound of boots on the stairs made the decision for her. Clara looked at Jake Morrison, this dangerous stranger who'd offered her the one thing she needed most, and nodded. "I, Clara Whitmore, take you, Jake Morrison, as my husband," she whispered rapidly. Jake's eyes never left her face as he repeated the words, his voice steady despite the approaching danger. They sealed their unlikely union with a brief, desperate kiss as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. The door exploded inward, revealing 3 armed men, led by a scarred bounty hunter with cold blue eyes. "Jake Morrison," the leader announced, "You're coming with us." Jake stepped protectively in front of Clara, his hand resting on his gun. "Seems you boys are a little late to the party." What followed happened with the swift violence of a summer storm. Jake's gun cleared leather first, but the bounty hunters were ready for resistance. The room filled with gunpowder smoke and the deafening roar of firearms. When the echoes faded, Jake lay on the floor, blood spreading across his chest. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against the wound in a futile attempt to stem the bleeding. Jake's eyes found hers, already growing dim, but still holding that strange peace she'd glimpsed earlier. "Mrs. Morrison," he whispered, a smile touching his lips despite the pain. The bounty hunters seemed disappointed by their quarry's condition. Dead outlaws brought less money than live ones, but paperwork was simpler. They left Clara alone with her husband of mere minutes, promising to return for the body once they'd collected their fee from the sheriff. Clara sat with Jake as his breathing grew shallow, holding his hand and humming a lullaby her own mother had sung years ago. When the end came, it was quietly, without drama or final speeches. Jake Morrison died as he'd lived his final weeks, seeking something he'd lost long ago. The next morning brought news that would change everything. A telegram had arrived during the night, carrying word from the territorial governor. Jake Morrison had been posthumously pardoned for his crimes, evidence having emerged that he'd been framed by the real bank robbers. More importantly for Clara, the pardon came with compensation for years of wrongful persecution. $5,000, a fortune by frontier standards, enough to start fresh anywhere she chose. Her brief marriage had given her not just legitimacy, but financial security beyond her wildest dreams. Standing at Jake's graveside a week later, Clara reflected on the strange turn of fate that had brought them together. She'd gained a name, money, and respectability, while Jake had found the redemption he'd sought, even if not in the way he'd expected. As she felt her baby move within her, Clara whispered a promise to the man who'd given them both a future. She would name the child Jake if it was a boy, and she would make sure they grew up knowing about the father who'd sacrificed everything for strangers he'd barely known. The preacher finished his words over the simple wooden cross, and Clara turned away from the grave. Redemption Creek stretched out before her, no longer a place of shame and struggle, but a starting point for whatever came next. She had choices now, possibilities that hadn't existed before a wounded outlaw stumbled into her saloon. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the prairie, calling travelers to new destinations and fresh beginnings. Clara Morrison smiled and walked toward the sound, one hand resting on her growing belly, the other clutching the deed to a small ranch outside Denver that would be perfect for raising a child. What do you think about Jake's decision to marry Clara despite knowing his fate was sealed? Was it truly selfless, or was there something more to his motivations? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what you would have done in Clara's situation.